Venice should not exist, and yet for centuries it commanded an empire built on millions of wooden piles driven into mud and sea. Its wealth came from shipbuilding, commerce, and a lagoon that once protected the city. Today, the same ingenuity is powerless against multiple compounding threats. Floods strike more often, the ground is sinking, and no single solution, including billion-euro barriers, can save what remains. The real story is not just that Venice is slowly dying, it is why, despite everything, no one can stop it. How did a city built to defy nature become so vulnerable? Venice began as a scatter of wooden huts on muddy islands built by refugees escaping war and chaos after the fall of Rome. What followed was one of history's most audacious construction projects, a city raised not on solid ground, but on millions of timber piles hammered deep into the soft lagoon floor. Each pile, usually oak or larch, was driven by hand and packed tightly together until the mud gave way to firmer clay. These forests of timber hidden below the surface still support Venice's grandest buildings. The secret to their survival lies in the lagoon's oxygen-poor waters, which keep the wood from rotting for centuries. Above these foundations, Venetians placed thick stone platforms, then layered on brick and Istrian limestone, creating the palaces, churches, and bridges that define the city's skyline. The lagoon itself shaped everything. Its shallow, shifting waters made Venice nearly impossible to attack by land. Armies bogged down in marshes, and only those who mastered the hidden channels could approach. Over time, Venetians engineered the very landscape, redirecting rivers to keep silt from choking their waterways and carving out canals that would carry trade goods from as far away as the Silk Road. The city's identity fused with its environment, always adapting and always at risk. At the heart of Venice's power stood the Arsenale, a shipyard so vast it became the industrial engine of the Mediterranean. By the late Middle Ages, the Arsenale could launch a fully equipped war galley every day, thanks to assembly line techniques and standardized parts, a scale of production unmatched in Europe for centuries. Control of the lagoon meant control of the sea beyond. Venetian pilots, raised on tides and fog, navigated routes only they could read, turning the city's watery maze into a shield and a highway. As historian Patricia Fortini Brown notes, the myth of Venice's origins is inseparable from its reality, a city chosen by the sea and protected by its own ingenuity. The same mud and water that once made the city unconquerable now set the stage for its greatest challenge, a fragile balance, always one storm or one tide away from disaster. Venice's genius has always been adaptation, turning mud into marble, risk into wealth. Yet the city now faces a storm of challenges that no single act of engineering or policy can hold back. What threatens Venice today is not just one disaster, but a tangle of forces that feed into each other. Scientists and city officials use a telling phrase: multiple compounding threats. The lagoon that once sheltered Venice now brings higher tides and more unpredictable floods. The very ground beneath the city settles millimeter by millimeter as the sea rises faster than ever before. Centuries of careful balance between water and stone, commerce and protection are coming undone, not from one cause, but from many all at once. No single barrier, law, or restoration project can untangle these risks. Each solution tackles only a part of the problem while the others keep growing. Some threats are visible in every flooded piazza or cracked foundation. Others are quieter, a slow loss of neighbors, a shop shuttered for good, a tradition fading as residents move away. Venice's struggle is not just about holding back water, but about holding together a way of life in the face of relentless change. Subscribe to Cityfall if you want to understand how cities rise, thrive, and face forces beyond their control. We bring you stories of places like Venice, cities shaped by ingenuity, now fighting for survival in a world where history, climate, and economics collide. The story of Venice is just one chapter in a much larger story about the future of cities everywhere. What happens next is not a single crisis, but a series of shocks and slow-motion changes. The water that once defended Venice now tests every limit, and the city's fate hangs on how it responds to these multiple compounding threats. High tide has always been part of life in Venice, but what was once a seasonal nuisance now arrives with a frequency and force that few older residents can remember. The term acqua alta, meaning high water, used to mean a handful of flooded days each year. Today, it means a city on constant alert. The official threshold is 110 centimeters above the tide gauge at Punta della Salute. A century ago, that level was rarely reached, just a few times in a decade. Now, it happens dozens of times every year. In the decade from 2010 to 2019, the number of events above 120 centimeters jumped from fewer than 2 per decade in the early 1900s to 40 in a single decade for the 110 centimeter mark. The count soared from 4 per decade to 95. St. Mark's Square, the city's iconic piazza, is underwater hundreds of times a year if even minor flooding is counted. The cause is not just heavier storms, but a slow, relentless rise in the baseline. Relative sea level in Venice has climbed 2.5 millimeters per year over the last 150 years. Half of that is the sea itself rising, the other half is the city sinking. Historic groundwater extraction in the mid-20th century doubled the rate, pushing the land down 5 millimeters per year between 1950 and 1970. Even after pumping was curbed, the combination of ongoing natural subsidence and global sea level rise keeps pushing the tide line higher. The night of November 12, 2019 brought the second highest tide ever recorded in Venice, 187 centimeters. 80% of the city flooded, power failed at St. Mark's. Shops and homes filled with water. The basilica's marble floors were submerged. Meteorologists traced the disaster to a perfect storm, astronomical high tide, low atmospheric pressure, a strong Sirocco wind, and resonance in the shallow Adriatic. No single factor was extreme, but together they pushed the lagoon higher than almost anyone alive had seen. For many Venetians, that night changed everything. Shopkeepers and families who had rebuilt after previous floods found themselves facing ruined stock and soaked walls yet again. Some called it the last straw. One resident standing in ankle-deep water in her living room said, "We cannot live like this anymore." The city's warning system, based on tide gauges and decades of records, had sounded the alarm, but the water kept rising. The 2019 flood forced a reckoning. The old rhythms of high water no longer apply. Now, every season brings the possibility of another record-breaking surge. The numbers on the tide gauge are more than statistics. They are the measure of how much time Venice has left before the next disaster arrives. Venice's relationship with the ground beneath it has always been uneasy. The city sits on a patchwork of soft, waterlogged sediments, layers of clay and silt built up over thousands of years as rivers emptied into the lagoon. These sediments naturally compress under their own weight, causing the land to settle bit by bit. For centuries, this slow-motion sinking was manageable, measured in fractions of a millimeter each year. But in the 20th century, the pace quickened dramatically. The turning point came with the rise of industrial Venice on the mainland. Factories in Marghera and the surrounding area began pumping vast quantities of groundwater from deep aquifers beneath the lagoon. Water that had taken centuries to accumulate was drawn out in just a few decades. As the pressure dropped underground, the overlying sediments compacted more rapidly. Between 1950 and 1970, Venice lost about 10 centimeters of elevation just from groundwater extraction alone. By the end of the 20th century, the city had sunk a total of 25 centimeters. Scientists estimate that roughly 60% of that drop was due to human-driven subsidence, not just the slow settling of mud and clay. When authorities finally recognized the scale of the problem, they sharply reduced groundwater pumping. The most dramatic sinking slowed, but the damage was already done. The city's foundations had dropped irreversibly, and the remaining natural compaction continues at a rate of about 1 to 2 millimeters a year, measured today by GPS stations perched on church towers and government buildings. Some neighborhoods, especially those near the lagoon's edge or on reclaimed land, still sink faster than others. The process is uneven, with certain islands and canal banks showing more pronounced settlement. Over the next 80 years, central Venice could lose another 12 centimeters to ongoing subsidence alone, while outlying islands may drop by twice that amount. This vertical motion is relentless and cumulative. Even if global sea levels were somehow frozen in place, Venice would keep lowering itself millimeter by millimeter. The city's historic buildings, supported by ancient timber piles, are not immune. As the ground compacts, entire blocks descend together, bringing stone, brick, and wood with them. The result is not dramatic collapse, but a slow, irreversible compaction that pushes the city ever closer to the water's edge. Every centimeter lost means the barriers built to hold back the sea must work harder, and the margin for error grows thinner with each passing year. At the three inlets where the Adriatic meets the Venetian lagoon, a line of engineering now stands between the city and the sea. moSE, the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, relies on 78 mobile gates, each a steel giant, lying flat and hidden beneath the water's surface in normal times. When a high tide is forecast, compressed air is pumped into the gates, forcing out the water and causing them to rise in sequence, pivoting upward until they form a continuous barrier across the inlet. This process takes about 30 minutes. And when the gates are up, they block the surge that would otherwise push into the lagoon and flood the city's streets. The system is divided across the Lido, Malamocco, and Chioggia inlets. At Lido, the longest stretch, two separate lines of gates protect the city's northern flank. Malamocco, the deepest channel, is crucial for port traffic and includes a special lock to allow ships to pass even when the barrier is closed. Chioggia to the south completes the defensive arc. Each gate measures roughly 20 meters across and up to 30 meters long, anchored into reinforced concrete caissons on the seabed. The hinges alone weigh over 40 tons, designed to withstand the relentless push and pull of tides, storms, and saltwater corrosion. Decisions about when to raise the barriers depend on a network of tide gauges, meteorological forecasts, and real-time data from across the lagoon. The control center, staffed around the clock, must weigh the risks of an incoming surge against the disruption to shipping and the lagoon's delicate water exchange. The official threshold for activation is typically around 110 to 130 centimeters above mean sea level, but operators sometimes act earlier if conditions look volatile. Once raised, the gates can hold back the sea for 4 to 5 hours, enough to let the peak of a storm tide pass. Lowering the system is slower, as water must be allowed back into the hollow gates before they settle onto the seabed. The control center balances safety and access every time. In its first years of operation, moSE has already prevented several floods that would have left St. Mark's Square underwater. For engineers, the achievement is both technical and symbolic, a demonstration that human ingenuity can still reshape the boundary between city and sea. One moSE engineer describes the system as a living machine, always adapting to new forecasts, always balancing the needs of the city with the forces outside. Each deployment is a race against time and uncertainty, with crews monitoring every pressure sensor, every weather update, every inch of rising water. The system's promise is simple: buy Venice time, one tide at a time, but the complexity behind each closure hints at the limits of even the most advanced defenses. For now, moSE stands as a testament to the city's determination to survive and a reminder that every barrier comes with its own set of trade-offs. The promise of moSE was simple: a barrier that could keep Venice dry no matter how high the tide. But beneath the surface, the reality is far more complicated and far more expensive. In 2014, Italian prosecutors uncovered a sweeping corruption network tied to moSE's construction. Investigators traced millions of euros in inflated contracts, kickbacks, and offshore payments. The mayor of Venice at the time, Giorgio Orsoni, was placed under house arrest. Executives from Consorzio Venezia Nuova, the main project consortium, resigned or faced trial. The scandal reached deep into regional politics and left a legacy of public distrust that lingers to this day. Even after the headlines faded, the financial burden remained. Official audits and technical reports estimate that annual operation and maintenance for moSE runs into the tens of millions of euros, sometimes as high as 60 million euros per year, depending on how often the gates are raised. Every closure means energy for compressors, specialized crews on duty, and wear on steel hinges exposed to salt water. Over decades, the total life cycle cost climbs into the billions. Major overhauls, removing and refurbishing corroded gates, and replacing worn components require hundreds of millions more, all while the city's budget faces competing demands. But the costs are not only financial. moSE was designed to be raised for a few hours at a time during the worst surges. As the sea rises, closures become more frequent, dozens, even hundreds of times a year under high-end scenarios. Each closure interrupts the natural exchange between lagoon and sea. Tidal flows slow, sediment settles, and water quality suffers. Lagoon ecologists warn that too many closures could turn the lagoon stagnant, threatening fish nurseries, salt marshes, and the delicate balance that has sustained Venice for centuries. One ecologist describes the risk: if the gates stay up too often, the lagoon will start to suffocate, The water needs to breathe. moSE's technical achievement cannot be denied. It has already prevented floods that would have left St. Mark's Square underwater, but every deployment comes with a price: financial, ecological, and social. The system was never meant to be a permanent wall, nor can it reverse the slow rise of the sea or the city's gradual sinking. As maintenance costs mount and ecological trade-offs become more pressing, moSE stands as a reminder that no single solution can secure Venice's future. The city's survival depends not just on engineering, but on the hard choices that follow: how to pay, how to adapt, and how to live with the limits of even the most ambitious defenses. Every year, more than 20 million visitors cross the bridges and alleys of Venice's historic center. On a typical day, the number of tourists sleeping in the city rivals the number of residents. When day trippers pour in, sometimes 25,000 or more in a single morning, the crowd can double the population of the islands. The scale is staggering. Fewer than 50,000 Venetians remain, but the city hosts 12 million overnight stays each year. During peak seasons, hotel beds and short-term rentals outnumber homes for locals. Tourism has become Venice's main source of income, but the balance is lopsided. Many visitors stay only a few hours, spending little beyond the price of a coffee or a souvenir. The city's narrow streets and fragile infrastructure strain under the weight of these daily migrations. Waste collection, water supply, and emergency services all run at maximum capacity, built for a community that shrinks every year. In the last decade, platforms like Airbnb have transformed entire neighborhoods. Apartments that once housed families now serve as short-term rentals, driving up rents and pushing residents out. In districts like San Marco and Cannaregio, the density of tourist accommodations is among the highest in Europe. Listings multiplied during the decade, starting in 2010, with thousands of properties available to visitors at any given time. For many landlords, the math is simple. A week of tourist bookings can bring in as much as a month's rent from a local tenant. The city's fabric is changing at street level. Grocers, hardware stores, and bakeries close their doors, replaced by souvenir stalls, gelato counters, and luggage shops. Where Venetians once gathered in Campi to talk or play, the flow of foot traffic rarely pauses. A resident who has lived near Rialto for 40 years describes the change. "I used to know every face on this street. Now most days I don't recognize anyone." The pressure is not just on the ground. In the lagoon, cruise ships have long delivered another wave of visitors, sometimes thousands at a time. On June 2nd, 2019, the cruise ship MSC Opera lost control in the Giudecca Canal and crashed into the San Basilio Wharf, scraping a smaller tourist boat and injuring several people. The incident, caught on video, became a flashpoint for Venetians who had warned for years that these enormous vessels were a threat to both safety and the lagoon's delicate balance. The crash fueled protests and deepened the divide between those who depend on cruise tourism for jobs and those who see it as a symbol of the city's vulnerability. Behind the scenes, the city government has tried to negotiate with rental platforms, seeking data to enforce local rules and collect tourist taxes. But enforcement lags behind the pace of change. The result is a city where the rhythms of daily life are set not by residents, but by the arrival and departure of visitors. The economic engine that once powered trade and innovation now runs on short stays and fleeting impressions. For many Venetians, the question is no longer how to welcome the world, but whether there will be anyone left to call the city home. A city is more than its stones and its water. In Venice, the slow disappearance of daily life is as visible as any high tide. The echoes start in the empty corridors of neighborhood schools. Once, children's voices spilled from classrooms in every sestiere. Now, enrollment has dropped so sharply that entire schools have closed or merged. Their doors are shut for good. In the district of Santa Croce, the last primary school closed in 2019. Parents who remain must ferry their children across canals and bridges to distant districts or to the mainland. Each closure is a signpost coast, fewer young families, fewer reasons to stay. The loss stretches beyond the classroom. Artisans' workshops, once the backbone of Venetian culture, are vanishing from the narrow Cali. Centuries-old traditions, from gondola building to glass blowing and textile weaving, struggle to survive as rents climb and skilled hands retire. In the past, every neighborhood had its own blacksmith, baker, and carpenter. Today, the shutters stay down on former Bateg, replaced by souvenir stands and fast food counters. The knowledge that shaped the city's identity passes quietly out of reach with each closing shop. One curator, standing amid a collection of tools used by generations of local craftsmen, put it simply: when the last artisan leaves, part of Venice's soul goes with them. In 2021, the world's attention turned to Venice as UNESCO's World Heritage Committee debated whether to add the city to its list of World Heritage in danger. The warning was clear: over-tourism, environmental neglect, and the loss of authentic community had pushed Venice to the brink. Italian officials lobbied hard to avoid the designation, arguing that it would damage the city's reputation and threaten the fragile economy. Emergency measures were announced: bans on large cruise ships, new promises for lagoon protection, and pledges to manage visitor flows more sustainably. In the end, UNESCO stopped short of the formal in danger listing, but only with strong conditions and a demand for real progress. The debate left no doubt that Venice's crisis is not just about water and stone, but about the slow erosion of its living culture. What is at stake is not only physical survival. A city can be kept standing by engineering, but it cannot be revived if the ties of memory, tradition, and community unravel. The risk is that Venice becomes a museum in the most literal sense, a place where the past is preserved behind glass while the present quietly slips away. The city's fate is now a diplomatic issue, a heritage question, and a warning to the world. As the school bells fall silent and the last artisan turns off the lights, the loss cannot be measured in centimeters of water or millions of tourists alone. Venice's struggle is a reminder that when a city loses its people and its institutions, what remains is only the shell of its former self. Venice is not alone in its struggle with water and the limits of engineering. Across the world, other cities face their own battles against rising seas, sinking ground, and the challenge of holding back nature. In the Netherlands, Rotterdam sits below sea level, protected by a network of dikes, levees, and one of the world's largest movable storm surge barriers, the Maaslandkering. This colossal gate swings shut only during the most extreme storms, sealing off the city from the North Sea. Yet Dutch engineers know that every centimeter of sea level rise brings them closer to the point where even their best defenses will be tested. More often, for longer stretches, and at rising cost. London's Thames Barrier, a series of massive steel gates across the river, was designed in the 1970s to protect the city from tidal surges. When it first opened, closures were rare, just a handful in the first decade. Now the barrier is raised several times each year. Planners are already debating what comes next, knowing that the system will one day need to be replaced or radically upgraded as tides and storms intensify. In New Orleans, the levees and pumps that surround the city are a legacy of centuries of adaptation and miscalculation. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, new floodwalls and massive gates were built to keep stormwater out, but the city continues to sink as drained soils compact and groundwater is drawn down. Engineers talk of managed retreat, the idea that some neighborhoods may not be defensible forever, no matter how high the walls become. Jakarta, one of the world's fastest sinking cities, is building a giant seawall to shield itself from the Java Sea, even as entire districts subside by centimeters each year due to groundwater extraction. Plans for a new capital inland reflect a hard truth. Sometimes the only option is to move. Each of these cities has invested billions in barriers, pumps, or levees. Each faces the same dilemma. Defenses that once seemed unbreakable now require constant vigilance, upgrades, and adaptation. The question is not just how to build higher or stronger, but how long any city can keep up with the pace of change. Venice, Rotterdam, London, New Orleans, Jakarta, each offers a different answer, but none has found a permanent solution. The struggle to live with water is no longer a local story. It is a global test of ingenuity, resources, and the will to adapt. Venice faces a question that no city wants to answer. What is worth saving when you cannot save everything? The city's defenders have poured billions into barriers and restoration, hoping to hold back the water and preserve the stones. Yet even as the gates rise and engineers patch the cracks, the tide of residents continues to ebb. Every solution comes with a cost, financial, ecological, and human. moSE buys time, but each closure strains the lagoon's fragile balance. Tourist taxes fill city coffers, but the streets grow quieter as neighbors disappear and schools close their doors. Preservation demands choices. Should scarce resources go to raising pavements and fortifying foundations, or to supporting families who want to stay? Is it enough to keep the facade standing, or does Venice need a living, breathing community behind them? Some argue that the city's heritage lies in its stones and canals, that as long as the skyline survives, Venice endures. Others insist that a city without its people is already lost, no matter how many tourists fill the piazzas or how many barriers hold back the sea. There is no clear answer. Each act of preservation, whether it is a museum renovation, a floodgate raised, or a law to limit short-term rentals, means letting something else slip further away. The question lingers over every policy debate and every family deciding whether to leave or stay. Is Venice being saved for the future or simply preserved for the past? If the city becomes a museum, who will be left to remember what it was like to live here? The world admires Venice for its beauty, its resilience, and its improbable survival, but the hardest choice may be deciding what kind of survival is possible and what must be let go. Venice now stands as a living warning. Even the world's most ingenious cities can be undone by forces they cannot outbuild or outspend. Today, its population is dwarfed by tourists, and rising tides outpace every barrier. As sea levels accelerate worldwide, Venice's struggle is no longer just its own. The fate of this city is a preview, a question every coastal community must soon answer. Share this story with someone who believes cities last forever.